Welcome to my channel. I'm Scott, and in this video we're going to talk about bankruptcy. Here are the topics we're going to cover. First, the high level. We'll talk about Chapter 7 and Chapter 13 bankruptcy. We'll talk about Chapter 7 again, but for businesses. Chapter 11, the other chapters. What is Chapter 22? The pros and cons of bankruptcy. Additional info, and the largest bankruptcies ever. So let's start with the high level. Bankruptcy is the legal process that allows people or businesses to remove or limit their debt. So really the purpose of bankruptcy is to give you a fresh start. Although if you're running a business and you're in a really extreme situation, you may be forced to cease operations. There is a negative to filing bankruptcy. It's going to stay on your credit report for many years. So it's going to make it really difficult to get a loan. And if you do get a loan, you're going to pay a lot higher interest than you would have if you didn't have that bankruptcy on your record. So if you're just a person, not a business, you usually file Chapter 7 or Chapter 13. Let's talk about Chapter 7 bankruptcy. When you file Chapter 7, you could eliminate unsecured debt, like credit cards, medical bills. And you can't really store money on the side, so after bankruptcy is complete, you have some cash to work with. You really should liquidate your assets and pay down as much debt as you can, and then file bankruptcy. So according to the bankruptcy code, you're supposed to liquidate all non-exempt assets. And after you do that, then you're supposed to file bankruptcy. So if you have any stocks or bonds, you're supposed to sell that to pay down debt. If you have a second home, or if you have a baseball card collection or stamp collection, you're supposed to sell that to pay down your debt. But you don't have to sell what's classified as exempt property. So things around your house, like your refrigerator, your stove, you don't have to sell that. Even though those are technically assets that have value, you need those to live. You don't have to sell your primary car, unless it's like a Ferrari that costs a lot of money. But if you have something like a Honda Civic or Toyota Camry, you don't have to sell that. Chapter 13 is less stringent than Chapter 7. Chapter 13 is known as reorganization. So if you have assets like a home, cars, you might want to file Chapter 13 if you can. This gives you the opportunity to keep your home, and the court will set up a repayment plan. So if you can get back on track within 3 to 5 years, then you should be able to exit bankruptcy. And the court will help you work with banks. So maybe you'll get a lower interest rate, or the bank will give you more time to pay down your mortgage. And the previous slide we just talked about was Chapter 7. That's liquidation. So that involves selling your assets. I remember when I was about 20 years old, my friend ran up a lot of credit card debt. He still lived at home with his parents. So he just filed Chapter 7 because he really had nothing to lose. But if you have a family, a home, you might not want to liquidate your home and force your family to live in an apartment or find another place to live until you get back on track. Now let's talk about Chapter 7 for businesses. It's also known as liquidation, whether it's for businesses or individuals. So when a company files Chapter 7, that means they're in really bad shape. The company has to cease operations. A trustee is appointed to liquidate the assets and use the money to pay off debts and equity. And the payoff structure starts with secured debt. Then if there's money left over, it goes to unsecured debt, then preferred shareholders, then common shareholders. So that's why if a company files Chapter 7 and you're a common shareholder, you usually don't receive anything. Secured debt is debt that's secured by an asset. If you get a car loan, that's like secured debt, because if you stop paying the monthly payments on that loan, the bank could take your car and sell it to recoup some of their money. And secured debt usually has a lower interest rate than unsecured debt, because if you stop paying the monthly payments on credit cards, the company can't really do much besides hassle you and put a ding on your credit report. That's why the interest payments are usually higher for unsecured debt. And if there's money left over after that, it goes to preferred shareholders. Preferred shareholders have features similar to equity and similar to debt. So they're like a hybrid between the two. So you can see it sits higher in a capital structure than common stock. And then if there's money left over after preferred stock, then it goes to the common shareholders. And Chapter 11 is mainly for businesses, although sometimes individuals do file Chapter 11. Really the goal of Chapter 11 is for the business to continue operating after bankruptcy and hopefully become profitable one day. Because the problem with Chapter 7 is everybody gets hosed. The investors get hosed. If you lent money to that company, you might only get 50 cents on the dollar, maybe less. If you're a common stockholder, you probably get nothing. If you're an employee, you lose your job. That's why they came out with Chapter 11, is to try to help the company continue operating after bankruptcy. Even though it's not an ideal situation for a company to file bankruptcy, it's at least better for everyone they file Chapter 11 than Chapter 7. But the success rate is not higher for companies that file bankruptcy. Only about 1/4 of the companies that file Chapter 11 do survive. And some companies start off as Chapter 11, then change to Chapter 7. So when a company does file Chapter 11, the day-to-day operations pretty much stay the same, although significant business decisions have to be approved by a bankruptcy court. Like for instance, if the company wanted to acquire another business or sell off a unit, that should be part of the bankruptcy filings. And to give you an example of how it may work with a bankruptcy, say there was a couple that owned a business. They owned a few laundromats and a grocery store. It wasn't a huge business, but it was a decent size, and they had to file Chapter 11 because they were running up a lot of debt. So the bankruptcy court may force them to close down one of their laundromats, the one that's losing money. The others are at least making money or breaking even. And they may force them to sell part of their business, the grocery store part. They never made a profit with that grocery store, it's just a money suck. But they do let them keep their other laundromats. So if you were going to this couple's laundromat, you may never have known they filed bankruptcy. The business probably didn't change at all before bankruptcy, during bankruptcy, and after bankruptcy. So they may have to lay off some staff because they did close that grocery store that had 25 employees, and they closed one of the laundromats that had a couple of employees. And the bankruptcy filing makes it a lot easier for them to renegotiate their debt with their investors and the banks. Maybe the bank will lower the debt or give them more flexible terms. And if they do end up staying in business at laundromat, it's a win-win for almost everyone, because they're able to maintain most of their employees and they could pay back most of their investors. There's other chapters to the bankruptcy code. There's Chapter 9. This is for municipalities. That includes cities, towns, villages, school districts. And this is a little more lenient because these entities aren't required to liquidate assets to pay off their debt. But they are allowed to stay as an operating entity but develop a new plan to pay down their debt. Because most people don't really understand this, but cities or towns, they're like a business. They need to generate money to pay their bills, and if they don't do that, they may go bankrupt or sometimes go away. There's some towns that become defunct. People just leave the town and there's really no one left. So the city or town you live in does generate income through taxes, and they use that income to pay their expenses. They have a lot of payroll. They pay the teachers, the police officers, they have to maintain the roads, because they may get money from a federal level, but they also need money from a state level and a local level, because the money from the federal level or state level may not be enough to pay all the expenses. And there's also Chapter 10 bankruptcy, which was replaced in 1978 by Chapter 11. So if you were looking at a 10K from the 1980s, you may see Chapter 10 in it. And you could just think of it as Chapter 11. 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, there was a lot of family farmers, which were set up like a company. There are still plenty of family farmers in the US, not as many as there used to be. And there's also family fishermen, and they could file Chapter 12, which is a way to restructure to avoid liquidation. And Chapter 15 is for foreign companies that want to access the US bankruptcy courts. You may have seen something called Chapter 22, but there's no such thing as Chapter 22. It's just a fun way to refer to companies that file Chapter 11 twice. A lot of retailers have filed Chapter 11 twice. Radio Shack, Payless Shoes, American Apparel. So there's lots of pros and cons to filing bankruptcy. The big pro is it allows a company or person to emerge from bankruptcy healthier and stronger financially. And the way it does that, it eliminates most or all of your debt. And it does reduce a lot of stress in your life, because you don't want to get sued by someone or harassed by debt collectors. It's like a get out of jail free card. The cons are it's bad for your credit, it's going to be harder for you to get a loan or access the capital markets, and you're going to be forced to sell assets pretty quickly, so you're likely not to get as much money because there's going to be a fire sale. And certain debts are not dischargeable in bankruptcy court, like for example child support or school loans. It's usually the debtor that starts the bankruptcy process. And the debtor is the person that's in trouble that owes all the money, but it is possible the creditor forces the debtor into bankruptcy. The creditor is the entity that lent money to the debtor, like a bank or investor. So they may force you to file bankruptcy. The way they do that is take legal action and sue you. And I read Chapter 7 may impact your credit for up to 10 years, and Chapter 13 up to 7 years. So even though you reduce a lot of your debts, it may make it really hard to get a loan or to get any type of credit in the future. And you can file bankruptcy multiple times, and I know with Chapter 11 there's not much of a waiting period between bankruptcies. But for other bankruptcies there may be time limits or long waiting periods between bankruptcy filings. And the largest bankruptcy ever was Lehman Brothers in 2008. They had nearly $700 billion of assets the time they filed bankruptcy. That's larger than most countries' annual GDP. So Argentina, which isn't a small country, ranks 21st in GDP out of 195 countries. So the amount of money that was wiped out in Lehman Brothers could have paid for all the goods and services for most countries in the world for a year. So for an entire year in Argentina, Sweden, or Poland, instead of these big investment banks wasting all that money, they could have educated, they could have fed, they could have inoculated an entire population for a year. And the amount of money Lehman squandered, it was more than the bottom 83 countries in the world, which is a population of 400 million people. So instead of burning all that money, they could have helped 400 million people live their life for a year. The second largest bankruptcy was Washington Mutual, also in 2008, $328 billion. Then WorldCom, they did a lot of funny accounting, overstating assets. That was over $100 billion. And GM in 2009 had $82 billion of assets. And the reason we have bankruptcy laws is for situations like this. This is not a scam company like WorldCom or Enron. General Motors has been around for over 100 years. They have over 150,000 employees. So 150,000 people rely on General Motors to pay their rent, to feed their family, to medicate their children. So it is an important company. It may not be the best run company in the world, but it's a lot harder to become profitable with a company that sells cars as opposed to a company that sells an infinitely scalable product like Google selling ad space. Next is CIT. The most recent on this list is PG&E, and then the Enron scam. So I hope you learned something new in this video. Please subscribe, leave a like, comment. Thanks for watching.